Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 7th of February, where I wanted to finish talking about A Sorrowful Woman and to begin talking about the short story, The Story of an Hour. And basically, where we left off with The Sorrowful Woman is that we began our conversation with the opening line. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother one too many times. And already that indicates that this story is going to have much more depth than the previous story that we read. We were talking about formula fiction, which is very predictable and very trite and very superficial. It's written primarily for entertainment and profit. Not that there's anything wrong with either one of those, but it probably is not going to be part of the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study, and that those works that are considered by scholars and critics that are worth academic study, they usually have a certain level of depth and complexity and sophistication to them. And that's definitely something that we see in A Sorrowful Woman. And we know that opening line that begins with Once Upon a Time is suggestive of a fairy tale, which we had read with Faye and Kai in A Secret Sorrow. But this is going to be a fairy tale that is upset because ultimately, one too many times suggests that this wife and this mother is feeling burdened and overwhelmed by her roles. Notice that there are no names used for any of the characters in this story. These characters are reduced to their roles and have no individuality. But ultimately, from the title and also from the story, we can see that this is the woman's story. It would be very interesting to read a story entitled A Sorrowful Man from the husband's perspective, or A Sorrowful Child from the child's perspective. But this was from the woman's perspective. And if we look at the time in which this piece was written, 1971, it was so important in terms of the women's rights movement, also the civil rights movement. It was a time of great turmoil with the Vietnam War as well. But if you know anything at all about the author, Gail Godwin, she oftentimes writes feminist texts, and you think about the time period, then it's pretty clear that she's using this story as an examination of what happens to female when female is not satisfied with the stereotype that society has offered her to fulfill, that of wife and mother. And certainly we can see that she lives a life of comfort and that she has financial security. The family can afford, for instance, to go out to dinner, hire a nanny, even have their laundry taken out. We know that the family dynamic is one that doesn't seem to present any kind of physical health issues, any kind of domestic violence, nothing of that nature. So, again, someone like Faye from A Secret Sorrow, this would be her ideal world: a supportive husband, a beautiful child, and financial stability. But of course, what we have is a character who wants more and doesn't know how to articulate that she wants and needs more. And part of that is because of the time period. It would probably be easier today to express those ideas, but certainly not in the 1970s. And perhaps it's because of works like this that has have led to the changes that have occurred in our contemporary times. But this particular piece specifically begins with A in the title, A Sorrowful Woman, which suggests one of many. If it was the sorrowful woman, then this would be this person's particular story. And it begins in the winter evening, and that sets a tone of negativity. The seasons are oftentimes used to illustrate times of one's life. So the spring would represent birth, and the summer would represent the height of life. The fall could represent middle age, and winter could represent old age. It also is representational of emotional states as well. And I think we can see that by setting it in the winter, there is this dark tone associated with it, especially because it's also set in the evening. And we can do with the times of days what we could do with the seasons, that basically dawn would be the height of life, and or the beginning of life, I should say, and then noon would be the height of life, and then you would have perhaps afternoon, which would be the beginning of middle age, and then finally evening or nighttime, which would be old age. So the tone is set very much by the setting, as we had discussed. If an author provides us with information about setting, then it probably has some importance. Notice how this story takes place almost entirely in the home, illustrating how the home basically is the only environment for this female, or one of the few environments for this female. In fact, the home in the past was oftentimes portrayed as a kind of prison for female. It's something that I talk about in my Women in Literature class from female authors from the 1800s. But this piece from the 1970s, which is still relatively contemporary, talks about many of the same issues that could be discussed in the 1800s, as we will talk about when we get to the story of an hour. The husband continues to say he understands, and we get the feeling in reading throughout the piece he does not understand. Now, we can't necessarily fault the husband for not understanding. Certainly, this is a time period when mental issues were not discussed. This is also a situation where the wife is not able to articulate her needs and her wants. So that said, the husband tries to be as supportive as he can. It always strikes me in the opening description when he's described as durable. And what an odd term that is, because durable to me, I always think of the tires on my car. They're quite durable. I don't necessarily think of a mate in that way, but he is durable in the sense that he's able to withstand quite a bit. And also the fact that in his attempt to help, he's really hurting her. There's a psychological term for this. It's called enabling. But we don't get any sense of ill intent here, just misunderstanding, even though he continues to say he understands. But I don't think the wife/mother understands herself either. Notice the use of color imagery throughout this piece. The child's eyes, the husband's shirt are both gray. Gray is oftentimes associated with negativity, with darkness, with sadness, a gray day. Gray is between black and white, so it's a sort of in between color. We could say that the woman is sort of examining what her roles are when there seem to be just two options, whether it be the one extreme of being wife and mother or the other extreme of no longer participating in society, and nothing in between. One of the more interesting episodes I think about this story is when the husband is helping the wife undress. And in a piece of formulaic fiction, this would be the prelude to probably an erotic moment. That's the last thing we get here. And there's reference to the bra and about how absurd it is that it's hanging, a vertical bra. And think about all of the possible symbolism with the bra. In fact, in the 1970s, women were literally burning bras as an indicator of their oppression and how they would no longer withstand that kind of oppression. Bras can be quite restrictive. Bras oftentimes are associated too with female sexuality. And again, this has nothing to do with sexuality. The idea that a bra could also be supportive, and what this woman is looking for is support, and she's unable to get it. So we could write, in theory, several paragraphs just talking about possible symbols associated with the bra. The woman talks about how she wishes there was instant sleep. That's a good amount of foreshadowing, a clue about what's going to come later in the story where she commits suicide. And I know that, and you're hearing this, some of you might be surprised. The woman commits suicide? Yes, she does. It's not directly stated in the story. It's suggested, and I'll go through those passages shortly. But it indicates the importance of reading carefully. So now that we've actually gotten to literature itself, we need to read in a way that we wouldn't have read with, let's say, Faye and Kai in A Secret Sorrow. We've got to read for the details, and I suggest 3 readings. The first reading just for understanding plot, what's happening. The second reading for analysis, why is it happening? And the third reading to reorient yourself, to refresh your memory before you're going to discuss the text or write about the text. The husband, because she's having such difficulty sleeping, is making her sleeping medication. Of course, that's not helping. That's in fact hurting, especially because he starts making it in batches a week at a time. That's going to be a little bit of foreshadowing because it turns out that that's how she commits suicide. She overdoses. And at one point, we see commentary about the child who's pretending to be a vicious tiger. And think about all of the symbols associated with tiger, of predator. This is how she sees the child. Maybe not literally, but at least symbolically, that this is somebody who can hurt her or drain her life forces. In fact, this child, when playing, he scratches her wrist, causes her to bleed. And think about how a very common mode of suicide would be slashing one's wrists. Again, some foreshadowing for the ending of the story. And when he brings her a grasshopper, a live thing, and she responds so violently, so vehemently to something like that. Again, this is a woman who is not able to embrace life because she's not able to embrace her individuality. At one point, she hits the child, and we are told as readers that she did it when she knew the man would see. This is a cry for help, in effect, that something is wrong. But of course, the man tries to accommodate the woman by making her roles as wife and mother easier, not necessarily questioning whether the roles are even something that the woman wants to fulfill. And they instead hire a girl who is the perfect girl. She's young, dynamic, but she's not pretty. And that part is important because if she were pretty, then she could be sexual competition. And we've seen this formulaic story before where basically the husband ends up having an affair with a hired help who's much younger. And that's not this story. This story is not going to be formulaic. But despite the fact that the girl is perfect, she's not a threat. She is a threat because she basically is able to perform all of the roles that the mother cannot perform and do so quite well. Whether it's because she's got a different temperament than the mother, or whether it's because this is a paid position for the girl, unlike the mother, this is an expected position for the mother. But regardless, the girl presents such a threat that ultimately the woman wants her fired. The girl's room is described. It's a white room. Think about all of the color associations with white. There are positive associations, renewal, rebirth, brightness. There can also be negative associations. White could be seen as boring. It could be seen as industrial. It could be seen in a way that's institutional. And keep in mind that the woman, after the girl is fired, moves into the girl's room as if the woman were trying to recapture her own youth. And there are references to that too. The story moves, remember, it begins in the winter evening to the winter afternoon. So since we're moving earlier in the time of day, and the common association is that the earlier parts of the day represent something more positive, then we're thinking as a reader, well, perhaps this means something positive for the mother. Maybe not positive for the family, but positive for the mother. The mother's wearing an old sweater from school. Again, she's trying to recapture her youth. And the woman spends a lot of time brushing her hair in that room. And we could do a lot with that detail. Again, it's all about the details and the possibility of what those meanings of details might be. So hair brushing is a type of self-care. We might argue that now the woman is caring for herself rather than for others, such as her family. Hair brushing can also be rather soothing because of the repetitious motion. So we could say that she's trying to soothe herself. Hair brushing also is represented through fairy tale because remember our opening line was once upon a time there was a wife and mother one too many times. You know your fairy tales, you know Rapunzel. You know the importance of hair for female beauty as well, and that female is oftentimes objectified and viewed as or viewed through her beauty. So all of that could be discussed with something like hair brushing. She's also thinking about writing, and in some respects, you may not have necessarily understood this particular reference because we haven't started talking about poetry yet. But there's a reference to sonnets, that she's thinking about writing a sonnet. So a sonnet is a very stylized poem. It's a very strict, very formulaic. It's got a certain length. It's got a certain beat or pattern to it. It even has a certain rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern. And the way that we determine rhyme for poetry, and we will talk about this when we get to the poetry section, is we look at the last word of each line. And what we do is the last word of the first line, that is identified as our first rhyme. And we use the first letter of the alphabet to indicate that. That's known as an A. And anything that would rhyme with that word would be identified as an A. And then we continue going down the lines until we hit a last word in one of the lines that does not rhyme with that A rhyme. And then that would be known as a B, the next letter in the alphabet. And then any lines that rhyme with B would be identified with a B. And we go on and on. So when they talk about ABBA in the story, they're not talking about the 70s rock group ABBA. They're talking about the rhyme scheme, where she's contemplating, how should my poem rhyme? And she gets to the conclusion that maybe my poem doesn't have to rhyme, or maybe it doesn't have to have a particular set length. This is very symbolic of what the woman's life is. That the woman's life as wife and mother has very strict guidelines that she's supposed to follow. And now that she's in this white room, she's separated herself from the family, so obviously she's not following these guidelines. What this means is that she's contemplating whether or not she can escape from these requirements and from these expectations. And in fact, by thinking about a sonnet, which very much represents her old life of restriction, and thinking that she doesn't have to write a sonnet, which is perhaps representing her new life, or the contemplating of a new life where she doesn't have to follow the expectations of society. One thinks as they're reading that this means that there's going to be some sort of an epiphany for the woman where she's going to be able to reach a certain level of freedom. Now, that's to say that, of course, the author wants us to feel a certain level of empathy for this woman, but that doesn't mean that we as reader can feel some empathy for this woman. Certainly, you might think that the woman is quite selfish, that despite the restrictions of her time period, she still has responsibility as mother, if not necessarily wife, a responsibility that she negates. And I couldn't argue with you in that case. But what is important is that when you're reading a story is you identify the author's perspective, and then you can decide whether you agree or disagree, or perhaps a bit of both, with the author's perspective. Now, the family has been reduced to basically sending notes to her underneath the door of the white room to which she has escaped because she can no longer interact with them. In some ways, this seems absolutely absurd. When we get to the poet Emily Dickinson, we'll talk about how her life, her real life, her biographical life, was perhaps equally absurd because she did very similar sorts of things in terms of trying to avoid social interaction. But I can't help but think of contemporary times where individuals basically in the same household are communicating through text rather than notes underneath the door. So perhaps as much things change, they remain the same as well. And the story moves to the spring. And again, if I know anything at all about the times of day or anything at all about some of the symbols and associations with season, I am expecting as a reader something positive for the woman, some sort of renewal. The author does this deliberately so the author can upset my expectations. Because the woman feels suffocated by joyful notes that are left underneath the door, because it looks like she's beginning to leave the room and engage in previous behaviors of wife and mother. So the family's overjoyed. They think she's getting better because that means that they can get back the woman who's not necessarily an individual, but who is a wife and mother, someone who's there to serve them. Now, certainly, there are other ways that we can read this story. And postpartum depression, because she has a young child, could also be a reading. Depression could be another reading. But again, the question is, Why would this woman feel depression? Or why would there be postpartum depression? And certainly there can be physical reasons for that. But when we think about the time period of this story and some of the symbols associated with the story, there is also social commentary about the restrictive role of female in society. So you have to accept that reading as well as other possible readings as well. So ultimately, we're given a small clue, and that the woman went to the cupboard and took what was hers. Now, what we are told is that this sleeping medicine is being kept in the cupboard. So and of course, the husband's baking it in weekly batches. So when she goes to the cupboard and takes what was hers, what she's taking is that sleeping medication. And then she completes this seeming laundry list of chores. In other words, she fulfills her expectations. She bakes and she sews and does everything that one would expect. In some ways, sort of preparing for the fact that she's no longer going to be there for her family, but also showing that she's capable of performing these roles. These roles just don't fulfill her. She doesn't necessarily want to fulfill these roles. And again, what do you do when you're trapped in a society that does not allow you to live outside of the roles and expectations that have been placed upon you? One of the most interesting, I think, statements in the piece is when the husband and the child come to find the woman. The child thinks the mother's sleeping, but the child also says, she's tired from doing all our things again. Out of the mouths of babes. The husband never comes to that realization. The child probably doesn't even consciously understand the realization that he's just made, that the mother is tired of doing all of their things again. She feels trapped by these roles. So when somebody says this job is going to kill me, they don't usually mean that literally, but this is what we see in this particular story. She's able to fulfill that role, but her response to that is to commit suicide because she knows that she's never going to be able to escape, at least in the societal structure that she lives in, from this expectation. We know that she's dead because the husband is checking her vitals. He checks her wrist, he checks her chest, he checks her eyes to see if there's life. And then he puts his head down into her hair in despair. And of course, the child, and not consciously truly understanding what's going on, saying, can we have the turkey for supper? And of course, that would be probably quite appropriate for a child to ask that question because, again, a child needs caretaking. But if you weren't sure how to proceed with this particular story, one of the suggestions I have is that in addition to these class videos, which obviously will help give you some clarity, there are usually questions at the ending of the story that can help direct your reading. So this would be on page 43 of the text that I had ordered for our class, asking us to talk about a secret sorrow and a sorrowful woman and the distinction between the two. And obviously, a sorrowful woman has much more complexity. And asking us what did we find appealing and interesting or unappealing or uninteresting in each story. This is the kind of question that doesn't have a right or a wrong answer. It's just merely personal reflection. How do the two women's attitudes towards family life differ in the two stories? And obviously, Faye wants a husband, wants a child, wants the fairy tale life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But now we have a woman who does not want these things and has these things, so how does she extricate herself from that? And the next question is, how is the woman's problem in A Sorrowful Woman made much more complex and Faye's A Secret Sorrow? And that's not to say that infertility, which was the issue in A Secret Sorrow, is not a complex problem. But the fact that this problem was resolved in a mere few sentences does mean that we are given a very superficial treatment of it. Notice there is no clear resolution in A Sorrowful Woman. Just like in real life, sometimes there isn't a clear resolution. How would you describe the theme or the central point of meaning in each story? Or to what extent might A Sorrowful Woman be an unromantic sequel to A Secret Sorrow? Or in other words, what happens after the happily ever after? Can both stories be read a second or third time and still be interesting? And this is my major criteria for literature, and that each time you reread, you should be able to have nuance and depth and complexity. I would argue that we could spend an entire semester just on A Sorrowful Woman and read it dozens of times and each time unearth new detail. Obviously, we don't have that kind of time. I don't think we could say the same for our first piece, A Secret Sorrow. How do you think a romance formula writer would end A Sorrowful Woman? Well, a romance formula writer would know that we would have to have a happy ending, and we don't get a happy ending here because we're reading a piece of literature. It doesn't have to follow a formula. Contrast what marriage means in both stories. Discuss your feelings in A Sorrowful Woman and how does she remain a sympathetic character in spite of her refusal to be a traditional wife and mother. And then we're told it might take more than one reading of the story to see that Godwin does not sympathize, or that Godwin does sympathize with her. So this is a clue or a hint of how we could read this story. Sometimes students tell me that they like to read the questions before they read the story so they have an idea how to proceed. Sometimes students say that they don't want to do that. They don't want spoilers. They'd rather read the questions after the story. Some students say they don't want to read the questions at all. They want to listen to the class videos and read the discussion forum responses, and then that could lead them to wanting to read the questions afterwards. So it doesn't necessarily how you go about it. This is just merely a suggestion. And then we're told that the happy ending of A Secret Sorrow may seem like a fairy tale, but it's realistically presented. One of the criteria of a fairy tale is that usually there's something strange, mysterious, or fabulous. In contrast, A Sorrowful Woman begins with an epigraph, which is the name of that opening line. When a story begins with an opening line, once upon a time, that causes us to expect a fairy tale ending, but the story is clearly a fairy tale gone wrong. And how might A Sorrowful Woman be read as a dark version of Sleeping Beauty, if you happen to know your fairy tales? Or critical strategies, which we had began the semester with. What critical strategy tends to lend itself best to your reading this text? I was suggesting that a feminist reading of this text is particularly useful because ultimately Gail Godwin is examining, among other things, what happens to wife and mother when she is part of a family unit in the 1960s and the 1970s and is responsible for others but doesn't have any kind of true autonomy. That's not the only way we could read this story, but it's certainly a good way to read this story, the most common way probably to read this story. Now, that said, we've spent a lot of time on this story, and as contemporary as the story is, relatively speaking, from the 20th century, the next story that I had assigned for us to read, The Story of an Hour, is from the 1800s, and yet it is so similar in so many respects. It's only a page and a half long or so, just to show how length does not determine complexity. And it's something I always think of when students ask me how long their paper should be, is that ultimately length does not necessarily correlate with quality or with complexity. The author, Kate Chopin, I know a little bit about this author, so knowing a little bit about her biography probably is useful in terms of understanding the story, that she was very much a feminist writer. And I can say that this is a story that my class covers in my Women in Literature class. So she's very famous, probably most famous for a novella, something longer than a short story, shorter than a novel, called The Awakening, about a woman experiencing a personal and a social and a sexual awakening. It was scandalous for the time. Basically, it led to her being blacklisted. But going back, it's a great read. I highly encourage it. But going back to The Story of an Hour, this is indeed the story of an hour, and it is a life-changing hour, which goes to show that a life can change in a split second, and certainly in an hour. And we are first introduced to Mallards. So this is Mrs. Mallard is the name of our character. And Mrs. Mallard is, I think, a very deliberate name. We aren't given her first name until later in the story because she doesn't have an individuality. The idea is that she's taken on her husband's name and her husband's title. Just think about the idea of Mrs., which denotes marital status for female. Male, as Mr., doesn't have something that's comparable. We can't tell marital status through Mr., but we can through Mrs. Again, think about the time period, 1894. Mallards. So oftentimes I have my students do a little bit of research about mallards and trying to find things associated with the mallard bird that might be applicable to this particular story. And I know that Kate Chopin oftentimes writes about bird imagery. The idea that female can represent bird, a female could be trapped in a cage, much like a bird, but a female can also experience a sense of freedom upon release from the cage. Mallards are ducks. They're very common. So perhaps we could say that this is a common experience for female. And also the idea that mallards, at least the females, are rather dull in terms of their coloring as opposed to the males, which are quite bright, perhaps suggestive of the idea that in this time period, for humans, males would be the ones who would receive the attention as opposed to females who would perhaps fade more in the background. And we could come up with lots of other associations with mallards as well. They tend to mate for life. The male, however, would be likely to leave the family. And again, you could think of some human parallels as well. But that bird imagery of being entrapped or flying, I think, is going to be particularly important in this story. When we're told about Mrs. Mallard, and we get her name Louise only later in the story when she thinks she's widowed. And notice how her husband is given his full name almost immediately, Brentley Mallard. Louise and also her sister's name, I think, are quite interesting. We can assume that her sister, who's given a first name, probably is unmarried, or else she would have been referred to by her title of Mrs. as well. And Louise and Josephine are both very interesting names because their roots are male, Louis and Joseph. Again, kind of illustrating the importance of male and the dominance of male in society. And we're told at the very beginning of the story that Mrs. Mallard has heart trouble. Heart trouble is quite different from heart disease. Heart trouble suggests the emotional issues associated with the heart, sadness, despair, as opposed to heart disease, which suggests physiological issues. So this is a little bit of foreshadowing here that Mrs. Mallard's heart is troubled. And the plot of the story is quite simple, is that basically she's told erroneously, not that she knows this, that her husband has died in a terrible train accident. And she goes off by herself, which that in and of itself would have been considered unusual in the 1800s, to go to her room to mourn. And instead of mourning, she rejoices and realizes that now she has the opportunity to experience freedom. And in fact, in the 1800s, widowhood was really the only way that a woman could have a certain level of independence and also financial security, assuming that the woman was left the estate. And it wouldn't go to, let's say, a direct male heir, let's say firstborn son. And notice that there are no children that are referenced in this story, unlike our previous story, A Sorrowful Woman, which makes A Sorrowful Woman much more complex. But nevertheless, in terms of Mrs. Mallard and women's roles in the 1800s, it was shown that oftentimes women who became divorced didn't remarry in the 1800s. Certainly, they didn't remarry at the same rate that men were married at when they were widowed. And there could be lots of reasons for that. But I would suggest that one of the reasons is that ultimately, if a female was widowed and had some financial security, she had everything. She had status in society, so she wasn't seen as an old maid. She had respect. And she had money, and she would lose that kind of control and power over her life if she remarried. This is something we will talk about when we talk about William Shakespeare and from the 1500s in England. But Queen Elizabeth, the queen in power, never married. And one assumes, in part, it's because she would have lost much of the power and control of the kingdom if she had married. But at any rate, to go back to this story, we get lots of symbols of freedom. Things like her looking out an open window. A window oftentimes is a representation of looking into the outdoors, the outside world, the freedom, especially when the window is open. I'll give you a little hint that we will be reading a story that talks about a window in a very opposite sort of way. So I'll let you know when we get to that. But in this instance, the window is quite positive. It indicates hope, opportunity, growth. The roomy armchair. Think about an armchair. It's a piece of furniture that's basically made for one person. Now that Mrs. Mallard no longer has to think about being part of a couple. The fact that it's roomy and comfortable, these are all positive associations. The open square that she looks at through the open window. Again, things are open and they're large, representational perhaps of what her new life will be like as a widow. Springtime, as I suggested, the spring oftentimes represents hope, renewal, rebirth. Sparrows, more bird imagery again. Rain, and rain can be seen as a negative, but it can also be seen as a positive because rain is necessary for life. And if we're in the midst of a drought, then we very much need rain. And we're also told that blue skies are beginning to show. So the rain is beginning to leave if we have any kind of negative associations with rain. But again, rain can be cleansing. Water can be cleansing, can represent a new start, a new growth, a kind of baptism, a kind of rebirth. And the idea even of the west, because we're told about the clouds in the west. So the actual directions, because the sun sets in the west. Perhaps we could talk about the idea that this is the ending of Mrs. Mallard's married life. But of course, when the sun sets, we expect it to rise again in the next morning. So the hope and the opportunity that Mrs. Mallard is considering for the future. We can also think of westward expansion, which was going on also in the 1800s. The idea of, in the United States, searching for new frontiers, new lands. And this is something that Mrs. Mallard is going to be experiencing as a widow. We're told she was young but repressed, and we assume that the reason why she was repressed because of her marriage. And at first she feels something creeping towards her. Creeping is very negative. And what she says, though, is quite telling. Free, free, free. Body and soul free. So I don't think it would be a stretch at all to say that she feels free. And in fact, this would be a great piece to quote. Now, we can't say that her marriage was in any way abusive or even terribly repressive. We don't learn much about her marriage, but we are told that her husband had kind, tender hands, and he never looked save with love upon her. So this is less about, the idea of the husband and more about the idea of marriage as a whole. And when she says that she will live for herself, one of the most powerful and interesting quotes, I think, is there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. This story is usually read as an examination of female being from a societal perspective trapped in marriage, and that something like widowhood could offer growth and hope and opportunity. But this sentence suggests that it's less about female and it's more about the institution of marriage that impacts both parties in that way. And notice that we're told about marriage with men and women. We assume a heterosexual relationship. Think about the time period in which this was written. Even Mrs. Mallard admits that she loved her husband sometimes. Love is quite a complex emotion, so it is possible to love somebody sometimes. And as she's thinking about spring and summer days, we're assuming all of these positives, at least for Mrs. Mallard. But of course, what we find out, the twist at the ending of the story, is that ultimately Mr. Mallard was not killed, and he walks in the door, and she's horrified. And part of the reason is because she's shocked. Who wouldn't be? We also know that she had heart disease, aka heart trouble, so probably the shock overwhelmed her. But we know something that her sister and her friend Richards don't know. We know that when she was alone in her room, she was looking forward to the idea of being a widow. So we assume that this is more than just shock or even relief that her husband is alive, because she loved him sometimes. But this is even more about disappointment and despair, because the freedom and the independence that she thought she would have has been snatched from her. Not that Richards would know that, or her sister Josephine. Again, keep in mind with a short story, we're given only the information that's necessary to understand the short story. So the author does not want us to speculate. So we could speculate about Richards, the friend. How could he have made such a horrible error? Was this done with ill intent? But there is no evidence in the text to suggest that. What we do see, however, is that a mistake was made. This isn't Richard's story. This is Mrs. Mallard's response to the situation of her believing that her husband is dead. And again, her response is quite perhaps unusual compared to what society would expect. And the ironic line, joy that kills, that yes, she's overjoyed in terms of perhaps the fact that her husband is alive, but she was also overjoyed over the fact that her husband was dead, or so she thought. So she no longer has that joy. So that's the irony, where you upset expectations. And keep in mind that, again, we have not only questions at the ending of these stories, but one of the things that I really liked about this particular story, The Story of an Hour, is that the editor directly asks you to consider how your reading could be influenced by bias, because we all have bias on one level or another. So it's not a question of eliminating bias, but just acknowledging our bias and understanding how that could influence our interpretations. And this is on page 18 of the edition I had ordered. Do you find Mrs. Mallard a sympathetic character? Some readers think she's callous, selfish, unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in the newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's death. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male-dominated society. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? Are your views in any way influenced by your being male or female? Does your age affect your perception? What about your social and economic background? Does your nationality, your race, your religion in any way shape your attitudes? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? Have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other works, predisposed you one way or another? So think about this, and that something like one's age, which is constantly changing, could influence a reading, which goes to show that readings are fluid. And even something like one's mood can influence a reading. The idea is that you are looking for pieces of evidence within the text in order to support your particular reading or position about the text. You're much like an attorney, using pieces of evidence in order to be able to support a case. And a good attorney can argue the prosecution or the defense. It's just a question of which pieces of evidence that attorney decides to present to the jury and to the judge. And of course, they make the ultimate decision. You even have an example in your text of not only somebody taking notes, annotating The Story of an Hour, where they're indicating things like the importance of names, but also a response to The Story of an Hour, which I had indicated earlier, I think of as sort of between a journal and a paper. It looks like a paper. It's quite well developed with polished sentences and complete paragraphs. However, the content sounds more like a journal, something more informal, where there are references to the father and his response to the reading. And there are also references to a grandmother and her response to the reading. And while that would be appropriate for a journal, it wouldn't be appropriate for a paper, which is an academic analysis. And we'll be doing both over the semester, both a paper and a journal. But we will begin with the journal. So we're now at the point of the semester where we have transitioned from our introduction to what literature is to actually reading short stories. So while it's essential that you do all of the reading, it's particularly essential that you read these short stories so that you can write about them. So for the journals, and you'll see this in the third section of our notes below, you'll see that I always include the notes from each class below my videos. Your journals are supposed to be about the short story unit now that we've begun reading short stories with A Sorrowful Woman. So basically anything from A Sorrowful Woman to the ending of our short story unit, which would be the short story Popular Mechanics, could be a choice you could select for your journals. I'm asking you to choose 3 of the short stories, though we're reading more than 3, and to write approximately a page or so in response to each of those 3 short stories. And you can reference them all together, but usually what most students do is they talk about them as independent units. What this means, if you write approximately a page for each short story, you would have a 3-page journal. And that's going to be due by the 21st of February, which is a Tuesday, because by that date we would have finished the short story unit. So you can have all of the short stories read by that point and discussed by us so that you can make a decision as to whether or not you want to select one story as opposed to another. However, you can always hand in your journals early. So once you've hit your 3rd short story, then ultimately you can hand that in. I am evaluating that informally on a checkmark system, with a plus being excellent, a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory. There's also a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, purely for content. You could think of it as a conversation on paper. And this is a place where you can note questions or observations that you had. This is a place where you can reference some of the content from the class videos, or also some of the responses from your peers in our class discussion forum questions. As I had indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read everyone's responses and my responses to them, because I will be responding to all of you. So I read everything. So for our next class, we are going to talk about the short story Rose for Emily. And you can see that in our notes below in the 3rd section. I was able to find a link for the short story Rose for Emily. There's some other readings from the textbook that I was not able to find available online. But interestingly, I have a student who found a link to borrow our textbook for free. And this is at the very top of our notes. A free link to borrow the textbook online for the Bedford Introduction to Literature. I've never used this link before, but as you know, the textbook is on reserve in the GCC library, but this could be also another option for you if you are looking for the readings that are not available online. This might be a way that you could access them. So what's left is basically you're talking about your discussion forum question. And that will be due on February 9th. That's Thursday at noon. And if you need an extension, please feel free to ask me. Which story did you prefer? A Sorrowful Woman or The Story of an Hour? And why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about A Rose for Emily. Take care. Bye-bye.